there's been an expansion of the professional managerial stratum under neoliberalism as production was offshored, centralizing management, engineering, design, legal, marketing, advertising, et cetera, in many of the Western countries. This professional managerial layer, you go on to say, elevated high above the mass of working people, enjoys many privileges, including access to private and public resources. Now, there are also, I think, among other things, this professional managerial stratum is tasked with the mind management of the masses through the bourgeois cultural apparatus, and that it is therefore a driving force behind so much of the dominant ideology within the imperialist core, including its anti-communism, its social chauvinism, and hence its pro-imperialism, as well as identity politics and other kind of obscurantist ideologies like postmodernism, deconstruction, and things like this. And so I think a further analysis of this class stratum would be very welcome, beginning with its historical formation and the global political economy that produced it. The history of imperialism, as we know from Lenin, would be very key to this analysis because he identified the material basis for social chauvinism, and that is that the extraction of monopolist super profits from peripheral societies created a labor aristocracy among the European working class, resulting in their embourgeoisement. But a further evolution of this through the course of the 20th century has been the development of this managerial stratum of the working class, particularly in the post-World War II era, that would go a long way, I think, to explaining how it's been shored up by agencies like the Central Intelligence Agency, by support for what they call the compatible or the respectable left, meaning the non-communist and pro-imperialist left. So much of this has been done, of course, by drawing on the opportunism of the professional managerial stratum. And one of the other great insights from Lenin is that it is perfectly obvious that social chauvinism's basic ideological and political content fully coincides with the foundations of opportunism. So a greater investigation into the opportunism and the way in which it's structured by global political economy, and therefore orients this professional managerial stratum to a pro-imperialist position, would be very welcome. We've seen this most recently, of course, with many of the pseudo-leftists. I'll give a shout out to Slavoj Žižek, who are completely on board with the pro-imperialist project being driven by NATO and the United States. So the Frankfurt School and Frankfurt School critical theory has been, along with French theory, one of the hottest commodities of the global theory industry. Together, they serve as the common source of so many of the trend-setting, globalized forms of theoretical critique that currently dominate the world market. The Frankfurt School's political orientation has therefore had a foundational effect on the Western intelligentsia and is situated at the very core of Western or cultural Marxism. What I would like to do here very briefly is recontextualize the Frankfurt School's work in relationship to the international class struggle, and in particular, the attempt, in the words of Cold War CIA agent Thomas Braden, to redefine the left as the compatible, meaning non-communist left, notably through the use of foundation money and the Central Intelligence Agency front groups such as the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which published Adorno in their journals and hosted Horkheimer at their conferences. Within this context, as we will see briefly, these two critical theorists, while offering some significant critiques of consumer society and the culture industry, were ultimately playing the role of radical recuperators. Cultivating an appearance of radicality, they recuperated the very activity of critique within a pro-Western, anti-communist ideology. Not unlike other members of the petty bourgeois intelligentsia in Europe, which form the basis of Western Marxism, they were disgusted by the savage barbarians in the East who dared to take up the weapon of Marxist theory a la Lenin and use it to act on the principle that they could rule themselves. From the relative comforts of their professorial citadels in the West, financially supported by capitalist foundations and imperialist states, they defended the superiority of the Euro-American world that promoted them against the leveling project of the Bolshevized barbarians in the uncivilized periphery. My talk is going to kind of just jump through a few highlights in order to respect the time, so bear with me. So when Horkheimer took over the directorship of the Institute for Social Research in 1930, his stewardship was characterized by speculative concerns with culture and authority rather than rigorous historical materialist analyses of capitalism, class struggle, and imperialism. He refused and had taken a very specific position regarding the Institute to engage with direct political issues. This refusal intensified when the Institute moved to the United States in the early 30s. The Institute adapted itself to the local bourgeois order, censoring its own past and present work to suit local academic and corporate susceptibilities. Horkheimer literally had words like Marxism, revolution, and communism expunged from its publications in order to avoid offending its American sponsors. Furthermore, any type of political activity was forbidden. Horkheimer instead put his energy into securing corporate and state funding for the Institute, which he did very successfully, and he even hired a public relations firm to promote its work in the United States. Amongst the elements that are operative behind the support of the Frankfurt School, it is important to recognize that they decided after their sojourn in the United States to move back not to East Germany, but to West Germany. And in order to do that, they entered into one of the epicenters of the global class war against communism and received ample funding from the Rockefeller Foundation in particular in order to be at the forefront of this cultural war against actually existing socialism. Horkheimer continued his censorship of the Institute's work, refusing to publish 2 articles by no less than Jürgen Habermas because they were critical of liberal democracy and spoke of revolution, daring to suggest the possibility of an emancipation from, quote, the shackles of bourgeois society, end quote. In his private correspondence, Horkheimer candidly submitted to an apparently sympathetic Adorno that, quote, it is simply not possible to have admissions of this sort in the research report of an institute that exists on the public funds of this shackling society, end quote. This appears to be a forthright admission that the economic base of the Frankfurt School was the driving force behind its ideology, or at least its public discourse. It is important to recall in this regard that 5 of the 8 members of the Horkheimer Circle had been employed by the US government and national security state, which had a vested interest in the continuing loyalty of the Frankfurt School because a number of its members were working on sensitive government projects. Adorno, after all, was brought to the United States originally to work on Paul Lazarsfeld's Office of Radio Research project, which received funding from the Rockefeller Foundation and worked very closely with the US national security state. In fact, 75% of its annual budget was made up of government money. The Rockefeller Foundation also funded Horkheimer's first return to Germany in 1948. And we should not forget that the Rockefellers are one of the greatest gangster families in the history of US capitalism, and they use their foundation as a tax shelter that allows them to mobilize a portion of their stolen wealth in the corruption of intellectual activity and culture. So with all of these ties to the capitalist ruling class in Western states, it should no wise surprise us that the US government supported the Frankfurt School's move back to West Germany with a very significant grant that amounts to over $1 million in 2022 dollars. The Institute also received support from private donors, the Society of Social Research, the City of Frankfurt, and it even signed a research contract with the Mannesmann Corporation that had been a founding member of the Anti-Bolshevik League and had financed the Nazi Party. One of the elements of the research that they did for this Nazi collaborating company was a sociological study of workers' opinions, with the implicit implication that such a study would help management stall or prevent socialist organizing. Shepard Stone, I think, most clearly identified the role that the Frankfurt School played for the corporatocracy in the US national security state. He was a director of international affairs for the Ford Foundation, where he oversaw their close work with the Central Intelligence Agency on numerous cultural and intellectual projects. And he sent a personal note to the State Department in the 1940s to encourage them to extend Adorno's passport, where he said the Institute for Frankfurt is helping to train German leaders who will know something of democratic techniques. I believe it is important for our overall democratic objectives in Germany that such men as Professor Adorno have an opportunity to work in that country, end quote. The Institute was doing the kind of ideological work that the US state and capitalist ruling class wanted and did support. Meeting and even surpassing the dictates of ideological conformity of the shackling society that funded the Institute, Horkheimer openly expressed his fulsome support for the US anti-imperialist puppet government in West Germany, anti-communist puppet government in West Germany, whose intelligence services had been stocked with former Nazis, as well as its imperial project in Vietnam. Horkheimer is on record as claiming, quote, in America, when it is necessary to conduct a war, and now listen to me, it is not so much a question of the defense of the homeland, but it is essentially a matter of the defense of the Constitution, the defense of the rights of man, end quote. Now, Adorno occasionally shirked in the political shadows, but in 1956, he supported, along with Horkheimer, the imperialist invasion of Egypt by Israel, Britain, and France, which aimed at seizing the Suez Canal and overthrowing Nasser. They referred to Nasser as a, quote, fascist chieftain who conspires with Moscow, and exclaimed, quote, no one even ventures to point out that these Arab robber states have been on the lookout for years for an opportunity to fall upon Israel and to slaughter the Jews who have found refuge there, end quote. So according to this pseudo-dialectical inversion, it is the Arab robber states, not the settler colony working with poor imperialist countries, that is fascist. Now, Adorno and Horkheimer published one of their most overt political texts the same year in '56. Rather than supporting the global movement for anti-colonial liberation and the building of a socialist world, they celebrate, with only a few minor exceptions, the superiority of the Western world while repeatedly disparaging the Soviet Union and China. Invoking stock racist descriptions of the barbarians in the East, these are their words, whom they describe as fascists who have chosen slavery. Adorno even chastises Germans who mistakenly think that, quote, the Russians stand for socialism, reminding them that the Russians are actually fascists, adding that the industrialists and bankers already know this, undoubtedly due to the threat posed by communism to their property interests. I believe, Horkheimer averred in a world historical conclusion that provoked no rebuttal on the part of his closest collaborator, that Europe and America are probably the best civilizations that history has produced up to now as far as prosperity and justice are concerned. The key point now is to ensure the preservation of these gains. Adorno and Horkheimer, of course, also supported quite resolutely the quote unquote totalitarian equivalence between fascism and communism, if this equivalence manifests itself in socialist state building projects, anti-colonial movements, or even new left mobilizations in the Western world. In all three cases, those who think they are breaking out of the shackling society of bourgeois society are only making things worse, according to Adorno and Horkheimer. Our philosophy, they write, and here I'm arriving soon at my conclusion, as a dialectical critique of the overall social tendency of the age, stands in the sharpest opposition to the politics and doctrine that emanates from the Soviet Union. We are unable to see anything in the practice of the military dictatorships disguised as people's democracies other than a new form of repression. Adorno doubled down on this and also added China as a reference point and said that he would have to go back on everything he's ever thought if he were to support anything that he sees in China and hence by extension in these Eastern Marxist movements that were changing the world, not simply interpreting it. So a final conclusion is the following. So the goal of this very brief analysis, which is part of a larger project, is not simply to demonstrate that Adorno and Horkheimer were on the wrong side of history, defending capitalist countries and their imperialist endeavors over and against the socialist world. It is rather to situate their work within the political economy of ideas by elucidating the relationship between their research and the intellectual apparatus that structured it. By intellectual apparatus, I mean the material system of production, circulation, and reception that forms an important part of the superstructure. As we have seen, they were amply funded and supported by the capitalist ruling class and imperialist states, including the Central Intelligence Agency of the US National Security State, which provided them with comfortable lifestyles and promoted their research as the most radical work on offer, precisely because they rejected as beyond the pale actually existing socialism and the entire tradition of revolutionary socialism. Far from being Marxists in the anti-revisionist sense, they were radical recuperators within the capitalist intellectual apparatus.
In my case, I advocate for, and this is a little bit of a complex term, but I'll explain it, variegated hermeneutics. So hermeneutics is just a system of interpretation, right? Or how you would interpret particular texts or cultural products. And variegated means that you look at the different levels, dimensions, and aspects. So you don't just take something as a totality, like all of Adorno's writings, and say it equals X. You look at the different aspects of those writings and dig into them and do identify, if there are indeed significant differences, various layers and dimensions to someone's work. And so even we had discussed, I guess, on the earlier part of this episode, the work that I'd done on Adorno and Horkheimer. And it's true that they have done some significant critical work on what they refer to as the culture industry. Adorno has written on the history of recording technologies, and some of these texts I think are quite important and significant. And so I think you can read those while also recognizing that a lot of the core of their work played a different function, which I'll get to in a moment. In the case of French theory, I think that, French theory is a kind of grab bag term, right? That can include a lot of different figures, including people like, I don't know, Louis Althusser or Poulantzas or Daniel Guérin, or, there's a lot of different figures who you could identify with that. And so it depends on the individual instances, but in many cases, there are elements that I think are definitely worth engaging in, but that you can then separate out the kind of wheat from the chaff, if you will, from what should be kind of, what is a worthy contribution, what is a significant contribution, versus what is willful obscurantism, superstition, even just nonsense in certain instances. And I have no problem calling that out because it does exist. In fact, it's a very prominent aspect of, in particular French theory, which has cultivated a form of obscurantism and self-referentiality that often produces the illusion of some deep knowledge when it's not a deep knowledge. It's a free association between cultural references within the bourgeois canon. And I learned that to do that, I could do that when I was 25. And so it's not a sophisticated form of analysis, and I think should be called out in many instances for being what it is. And so within that kind of variegated hermeneutics, I would then also add, and this is for me a fundamental part of my work, is that I also want to ask a really simple and basic question that is almost never asked within the professional managerial class and intellectual settings. And these professional managerial class people will often just belittle this question as being too simple or too reductive. And that is, well, what is the position of this work within global class struggle? What did it contribute, or what did it not contribute? And if you look at particular figures or traditions, as I have done, I think that you find very clearly that there is a bedrock anti-communism that is extremely widespread within German-style critical theory and French theory that should and needs to be called out for what it is, and that also functions as an intellectual impediment to people engaging with intellectual traditions that don't just have a little bit of kind of ideas on the margins that they might be able to contribute, but actually has been dedicated for centuries to developing theoretical tools that elucidate the concrete functioning of the actual world and provide elements for a transformation of that world, right? And these are people who aren't read in the capitalist intellectual apparatus. I'm thinking of, obviously Clara Zetkin or Ho Chi Minh or Claudia Jones or Michael Parenti or Domenico Losordo and many, many others. These are thinkers who are not dedicated to the kind of idiosyncratic production of a consumer product for the market that they want to differentiate from every other consumer product, which is what Deleuze does and what Derrida does and what Levinas does or did, because they've all passed away now. But instead, they are part of a collective tradition that is fallibilistic, that recognizes that any theory is only as good as it being tested out in practice. And so it always has to be changed in relationship to different situations and different practices. But that is ultimately aimed towards human liberation and human emancipation, towards a more egalitarian and ecologically sustainable world. And so in that regard, I often say to students who ask me, like, if you can find something in Adorno or Foucault that you find particularly helpful, flesh it out, deal with it, engage with it, compare and contrast it also to other sources, but also ask yourself two other really important questions. Why is it that you're reading Foucault or Adorno in the first place? Who brought that to you? Who put it on your table and said, this is the most important thing and the thing you're supposed to read? And then the second question is, well, the time you spend reading Adorno and Foucault and Horkheimer and other people would be time that you're not reading Clara Zetkin and Jose Carlos Mariátegui and a lot of other people. So you should really think seriously about who's promoting particular work, why it is that you're compelled to read it or feel compelled to read it, and what is it that you're not reading, and what is the knowledge that might be inherent within these other things that have been excluded from the academy that might be worth reading for precisely the reasons that we're talking about, and that is the development of a more egalitarian world. One of the fundamental issues is the deep history of social chauvinism, meaning the belief that one society that you're born into is somehow far superior to all others. And there is a profound Western social chauvinism, the assumption that the most important ideas are the ideas from Europe or from the Euro-American or transatlantic world, not those ideas and, for that matter, practical traditions that would be situated in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, etc. And so there's a book that's, it's not available in English yet, but it's coming out in fall by Domenico Losordo called Western Marxism, which I think really diagnoses this problem. And Losordo's work in general does it better than anybody else I know.
Mm-hmm,
yeah, it's absolutely top-notch work. And one of the things, he points out many things, but one of the elements that is important for the topic that we're discussing is that what's called Western Marxism or cultural Marxism has unfortunately a very deep history of social chauvinism, and also a deep history of giving up on socialist projects as soon as they actually become material realities. Meaning that there's a kind of radical, quote unquote, radical tendency to embrace and even celebrate forms of revolt and popular resistance as long as they don't succeed, right? So the kind of profits of popular failure is what we're left with in the Western world. And almost all of them, at least the most prominent ones, those who are really promoted to the forefront, like Zizek and others that we were talking about, are those who are also simultaneously, they condemn and criticize all forms of actually existing socialism. In fact, sometimes they'll just say, well, there's not even socialism, it's just capitalism or authoritarian capitalism or other such nonsense. And so within the Western world, there has been, I think, and Western, of course, I'm not using as like a geographic category, it's more a political, economic category. There has been a consolidation of a particular compatible left, if you will, which is not to say that there aren't people within that world who are leveraging power against it and struggling against it in various ways. Of course, there are. Domenico Losordo was Italian, after all, right? He was within the capitalist core. But I would say that internationally, there has been enormous success in developing both theoretical and practical tools for a transformation of the world. And that if we look to, anywhere from Latin America to Africa to Asia, there are innumerable examples of people who are advancing historical materialist modes of analysis that themselves are embedded within popular anti-colonial struggles for liberation and struggles for socialist state building projects. And that in that regard, and this is what Losordo refers to as kind of Eastern Marxism, again, not as a geographic category, but as a category for those who have developed historical materialist modes of analysis that are embedded within practical struggle and that are enriched by those practical struggles. And so in that regard, I think that if you stand back from it far enough to be able to see it, at a certain level, it kind of makes sense from an ideological, a position of ideology critique. It makes sense that the part of the world that has been boosted by the kind of wages of colonialism, that has been given small crumbs by the capitalist ruling class because it was easy because of all of the wealth accumulation within the capitalist core, that it'd be much easier to kind of seduce through the use of money and institutional power and other such things, the intellectual class within those societies. Whereas if you're living within a colonized country that has been subjected to, depredation and kind of super predatory forms of exploitation and oppression. In certain instances, not in all by any stretch of the imagination, because a lot of this depends on one's agency and one's ability to see what's going on collectively with others. But in many instances, it's much easier to see from the global south that the kind of radical posturing is not sufficient, right? That we need something more than that. Of course, there's another phenomenon for that, and that is the continuing cultural imperialism that goes on around the world, where there's a professional managerial class globally that the capitalist core is shoring up and trying to shore up within, Latin America is an easy example because it's so prominent within the United States, in which there are intellectuals who are really kind of, towing the same line as a lot of the intellectuals within the capitalist core. And they're the ones who are severed from these popular struggles from below. They're the ones who are given big university positions and given keynote lectures and other such things. So I think the broader global political economy of knowledge production allows us to see more clearly why it would kind of make sense that the capitalist core would be easier to shore up ideologically than the global.
Important to distinguish between, and it's a heuristic distinction, but it might also pick up on Pierre's comments and questions, the difference between an interpretation and an intervention. And an interpretation is a mode of theoretical practice that operates within the extant system of coordinates. And so if you're trained in philosophy today and you want to get a job in social and political philosophy, you should write your PhD on John Rawls at Harvard and pursue that accordingly. That type of theoretical practice then is one that is well oiled by the machinery that we have, and it's what we're all encouraged to do. An intervention is an attempt to not simply play by the rules of a well-established social game, because that's all that it really is when you think about it, but instead it's an attempt to intervene at the level of the very rules of the game. Mm-hmm. And so what that does mean is that you don't simply play the game as you're supposed to within a particular discipline, within particular cliques, within particular cultural settings, universities, etc. But in order to intervene successfully, I think that you have to have sites of leverage. Mm-hmm. And an intervention of the kind of mightier than thou, I am unsullied by any institution whatsoever, and am completely outside of everything, ultimately means you might run into, I think, some of the problems that Pierre's highlighting, and that is that, well, then you have absolutely no traction. And so I think one of the major conundrums is how you can intervene within the extant systems in order to gain traction, because intervening in is always taking seriously the given situation, how it operates. And so in many ways, my own work as well at a practical and methodological level is precisely an attempt to intervene. And intervene has not come from absolute outside. There is none, as far as I'm concerned. I think that's a kind of anthropological myth of the 19th century, that there's this pure outside that one could somehow get to. And so then that, of course, at least for me, gives methodological framing. Then a whole series of other questions come, like how exactly you do that, what are the concrete nuts and bolts, which I'd love to talk about as well. But that's how I understand it.
I mean, one thing I would just add to this, just speaking from my own experience in terms of how to do that, for me, it is also being pretty open-minded about where disciplinarily, where my work might end up, because it's not, I don't expect it to have a lot of resonance in art history, for example, because of how that discipline works. But, I've just found, in a very practical sense, communities of interlocutors across a lot of different disciplines, and that would not necessarily be the place where you think necessarily art is going to be studied.
And a lot of them outside of the academy.
And a lot outside the academy.
The intellectual production and cultural production that's done outside of the academy is, of course, not only enormous, but some of the most fascinating and powerful intellectual and cultural production of the contemporary era. If you look at, we were just talking about this the other day, but if you look at the 20th century and you want to highlight the titans of American philosophic thought of the 20th century, most of those people were part of the Black radical tradition and completely outside of the academy in various ways. And so I think it's also important not just to have the academy or other institutions become the sole sites of intervention, because we have to recognize them for what they are and the limits of intervention within those particular interstices. Online folks, but it's a question concerning the relationship between difference and totality and the kind of historiographical evolution of French thought and how Rancière is situated in relationship to it. I think that you're absolutely right that the way in which
the emergent discourse on difference was coded within the French context. And this is, I've been quite, not necessarily flippant, but I've been saying things quickly that have years and years of research behind them. But one of the reasons that I'm critical of the difference discourse is the way in which it emerged in the French context is in a very precise fashion. And that is that at the end of World War II, the French intelligentsia, for the most part, were all communists, all hard leftists, in part because the right-wing people and the liberals had followed with the fascist regime and the Nazi occupation because that's what they do historically. And so the only people who had political legitimacy in the post-war was the hard left. The intelligentsia of the 1950s, early 1960s was then an internationalist Marxist intelligentsia, and they were targeted by the US administration, by the deep state as the enemy numéro un, at least in the field of soft power and intellectual production emanating out of Western Europe, Sartre in particular, but by extension, Simone de Beauvoir, Fanon, and other such figures. With the emergence of French theory and the discourse on difference, what you have is an extremely poor historiography that is premised on the idea that a certain mode of thinking was the reason that the Holocaust came about. And that mode of thinking was totalitarian in some way because it was thinking sameness, identity, and this is what Hegel did, and this was somehow continued. And we can mine into the work of Heidegger, who was actually a fascist and actually ran as a rector of the university and was responsible for establishing the relationship between that university and death camps. We can mine in him a particular understanding of difference that we can conceptually mobilize against totalitarianism and against totality thought. And so what you have is a shift from a materialist left-wing politics to a kind of ethical, discursive orientation in which thinking otherwise is the way you escape being a fascist. This transformation goes hand in hand, historically, as it develops through the course of decades, with the emergence of the new philosophers and the discourse on anti-totalitarianism. Totalitarianism itself is a purely ideological concept. It was invented, promulgated, and spread precisely in order to create the most confusing historiography I think ever created, at least in the 20th century. And that is the idea that there's some type of similarity between right-wing fascism, which is pro-capitalist and driven by things like the Nazi machine or the fascist regime in Italy, and communism, which is radically anti-fascist, egalitarian, and anti-capitalist. It's, choose your metaphor, apples and oranges, water and oil, etc. And they had just fought an enormous bloody war in which, tens of thousands of people, communists, had died, been sent to gas chambers, etc. And so totalitarianism is the way of obliterating history in the name of a monolithic, what the French call a concept valise, so a suitcase concept. It's a great idea, we should have it in English. A suitcase concept is a concept that functions like a suitcase, because you just throw a bunch of junk in there and you just close it up and you pretend like it sticks together. That's how totalitarianism functions. And so when someone like the young Derrida goes after Foucault for his totalizing gestures and giving his history of madness and says that this is totalitarian, what there is the discursive implication that somehow his way of writing and his way of thinking is going to ethically save us from this pernicious way of thinking that led to the Holocaust. That's idealism 101. It's the idea that ideas are the motors of history, not material forces. The reason that we had the Holocaust, there's a million different reasons, but a lot of it had to do with the crisis of capitalism in the interwar period and the emergence of fascism as a solution to the crisis of the nation states, the economic depression, and to various forms of class warfare, and the wins on the part of the left in the interwar period from the Russian Revolution, Spanish Revolution, the Popular Front, the United Front, etc., which were partial wins in many ways, not total wins. And so in that sense, I think that we really have to understand that conjuncturally. And I find it problematic for all the political reasons that are probably implicit in everything.
How would you think about that? That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think the social stratification of course Rancière recognizes that certain forms of social stratification exist. One of the things that I find highly problematic, and I would love to interrogate him about in person, is the ways in which he shifts from a discourse of exploitation to one of oppression, which is a classic way in which the ostensible hard left intelligentsia has reinvented itself in the neoliberal conjuncture. There's many other intellectuals I could point to who have done the exact same thing. So instead of there being class relations, this is what he stated on the yellow vests, for instance. It's not a class struggle for him. I don't know how you can make that statement. It's just quintessentially false. It's like saying there's not gravity. Instead, there's a struggle regarding oppression. And oppression has to do with who is excluded from certain communities. Okay? And so, la part des sans part, the part that has no part, is the part that's excluded, but it's excluded in a sense that it's oppressed because it's not given an allocated role within society. And that's very different from someone who's materially exploited and who is economically degraded in such a way that they don't have the conditions of possibility of survival, or they're targeted as surplus population. So I think what you have in Rancière is an awareness of and a willingness to conceptualize oppressive stratification with a rejection of the exploitative stratification of socioeconomic relations. Now, regarding the principle of equality of intelligences, I mean, I don't know, there's a lot that could be said about this. One of the problems in relationship to class warfare is that it's unclear what it means for all of us to, in principle, have equal intelligence when we clearly do not have equal socioeconomic standing. And even if we do have equal intelligence, if you are in a CIA black site or working in a sweatshop in Southeast Asia, does that intelligence even matter? Is there any manifestation of it that could have some type of material consequence? And so I think the bracketing of these material questions really has far-reaching consequences for what politics ends up meaning, because it's more about, he does, he's not a liberal and he's critical of political liberalism, so he doesn't just have a discourse on inclusivity. Like, let's just include more people and more people, but there's nonetheless a sense that, there's something akin to just a redistribution of social roles, but not of economic means would be sufficient. And given the things that we talked about yesterday and the fact that basically 80% of the world's population is absolutely destitute, I take that to be intellectually irresponsible in our historical conjunction.
So the professional intellectuals in the imperial core are generally disconnected from the struggles of working people. While this is commonly the case on the domestic front, they're even more detached from the international working class in the global South. Unsurprisingly, then, they often take political positions that are detrimental to the working and oppressed masses of the world. The phenomenon known as Western Marxism is an excellent example, as are the various forms of Western radical or critical theory. While sometimes advancing pertinent critiques of capitalism, and in particular of subjective experiences within consumer society, these traditions have more or less systematically advocated for ABS theory, anything but socialism. They've rejected every type of socialism in the real world, unless, of course, it is a form of so-called democratic socialism that is not a serious threat to capitalism, but rather a class compromise. This means that they advocate for a BS theory, because they refuse to embrace the real material solution to the problems of capitalism, which is the difficult but necessary construction of socialism. This situation has led to an understandable skepticism on the part of many workers regarding any possible positive contribution by the professional intelligentsia, or at least those ensconced within the academy, since there is often a remarkable amount of faith placed in other segments of the intelligentsia, such as journalists and pundits interviewed in the mainstream media. In a country like the United States, such skepticism, though partially justifiable, is enhanced by the deep-seated anti-intellectualism that plagues the country's culture. For those invested in a meaningful transformation of society in an egalitarian and sustainable direction, this skepticism has often led to ultra-leftist positions that consist in maintaining that workers can and should make a revolution on their own, without the pernicious influence of professional intellectuals. In many organizing circles, including political parties, this anti-intellectualism often goes hand in hand with a form of populism that fetishizes the spontaneous thoughts and actions of workers. Such a position, I will argue, is dangerous and counterproductive. In What is to be Done, Lenin clearly stated that bourgeois theorists are not only helpful to making a revolution, insofar as they are capable of providing a theoretical map of the social totality and how to transform it, they are actually necessary for revolution. and it is naive and short-sighted to rely on spontaneous workers' consciousness. Quote, this is from Lenin's What is to be Done. All those who talk about exaggerating the importance of ideology, about exaggerating the role of the conscious elements, etc., imagine that the pure and simple labor movement can work out an independent ideology for itself, if only the workers take their fate out of the hands of the leaders. This, Lenin says, is a profound mistake, end quote. The peerless leader of the Russian Revolution thereby took a categorical position that cuts directly against the grain of the ultra-leftist celebration of autonomous and spontaneous worker struggles as capable of leading directly to socialist revolution, as well as against the widespread anti-intellectualism that plagues a country like the US. There are many reasons for Lenin taking this position, but I'd like to simply highlight two. The first is that he insightfully elucidated why the spontaneous consciousness of workers tends to be trade unionism, insofar as they gravitate toward political positions that serve their personal economic interests, such as increases in wages, shorter work weeks, more benefits, and so forth. Moreover, within the imperial core, workers have often engaged in social chauvinism by ignoring the plight of workers in the colonial and semi-colonial periphery, while aligning themselves on the interests of their national bourgeoisies. This means that spontaneous workers' consciousness tends to remain within bourgeois ideology, insofar as they are trained within the capitalist system to look out for their own material interests and to preserve their position atop the imperial pyramid. Second, Lenin maintained that the power of Marxist theory consists, among other things, in the ability to move from the level of subjective experience to an objective analysis of the social totality. It is capable of explaining why the subjective ideology of workers is the result of objective social forces, if it be the subjectivism that pervades capitalist ideology or the social chauvinism that results from imperialist socio-economic relations. It can, in other words, concretely abstract from the immediacy of personal experience in order to elucidate the system of relations that produces that experience in the first place. Since spontaneous thought and action within capitalism are necessarily subordinated to bourgeois ideology, this form of objective analysis that you get in Marxist theory can contribute to the development of socialist ideology. This, very precisely, is the role of the bourgeois intelligentsia, according to Lenin, and he cites Kautsky and uses the term bourgeois intelligentsia. On the basis of profound scientific knowledge, it produces the ideology of socialism, which does not naturally or organically arise within the working class. Now, this does not mean, as Lenin clarifies in a very important footnote, that, quote, the workers have no part in creating such an ideology, end quote. But they do so not as workers, but as socialist theoreticians who are capable of acquiring the knowledge of their age and advancing that knowledge. I'd like to shift now to the question of the imperial petty bourgeoisie and the intellectual labor aristocracy. So the PMC stratum in the imperial core is not only situated above the working class domestically, it is also positioned at the apex of an international pyramid, both economically and ideologically. In the case of professional intellectuals, those intellectuals beneath them domestically or in the imperial pyramid are generally obliged to subordinate themselves to their dictates. There is thus an intellectual labor aristocracy, just like there is a manual labor aristocracy, although the former is elevated both economically and ideologically. So the intellectual labor aristocracy serves as global power brokers in the realm of ideas. To take a recent example, major figures in the tradition of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, which has been a core contributor to the legacy of Western Marxism, have taken strong public positions on the question of Palestine. Jürgen Habermas and Rainer Forst co-authored with others a text entitled Principles of Sovereignty, in which they wrote, quote, despite all the concern for the fate of the Palestinian population, the standards of judgment slip completely when genocidal intentions are attributed to Israel's actions, end quote. In perfect line with the dominant ideology in the imperial core, they suggest that attributing genocidal intentions to the Israeli government would inexorably lead to anti-Semitism, as if the anti-imperialist critique of the state of Israel could only be understood through a culturalist lens as a condemnation of all Jewish people. This anti-Marxist, culturalist form of identitarian thinking
means, in short, that there simply is no space for an anti-imperialist critique of the Israeli state. It is foreclosed as anti-Semitic. Moreover, the authors Habermas and Forst leave out of their discussion the patent fact that many members of the Israeli leadership have clearly and repeatedly stated their genocidal intentions, and their words have been fully backed up by their deeds. At this point, at least 17,000 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th, and about 1.9 million have been displaced, according to the UN. To put this in perspective, these numbers now surpass the 1948 Nakba, when some 15,000 people were killed and 800,000 displaced. Shayla Ben-Habib, a political science professor at Yale University, has taken a very similar position. I'm going to jump over this material in the interest of time, but she basically says that we can't look at the conflict in Palestine uniquely through a settler colonial lens, and plays the petty bourgeois card of it's more complicated, meaning it's more complicated than imperialism. And there's an excellent article by Muhammad Ali Khalidi that goes after her on this front, and also points out a number of the disingenuous mischaracterizations that are in her article. So when world famous professional intellectuals like Shayla Ben-Habib, Jürgen Habermas, and others of their ilk reprimand those critical of Israel's settler colonial project and recent genocidal assault, made possible, of course, by imperialist countries that support Israel, and especially the United States, they are exercising their power as members of the intellectual labor aristocracy to discipline those beneath them, both within their respective countries and internationally. They are also seeking to corral and control public opinion by exercising their so-called expertise, which is itself a product of the imperial intellectual apparatus that forged them as intellectuals. When they parrot the fundamental core of the dominant ideology of the US State Department, they are quite literally doing their job as imperialist ideologues who are perched atop an international hierarchy of knowledge production for a reason. So the petty bourgeois class stratum is itself notoriously unreliable and unstable. It works for and is subservient to the capitalist ruling class, and it generally promotes the dominant ideology, as I've just demonstrated briefly with the examples I highlighted. However, bereft of the power of its corporate overlords and beholden to their decisions, it often expresses resentment and frustration, and it sometimes presents itself as being on the side of the masses. One of the most common orientations of this latter group, those who feign to be on the side of workers, is petty bourgeois radicalism. It consists in proposing magical solutions to very real problems. This can take very different forms, but one of the most common is third-way politics that identifies the pernicious effects of capitalism, but condemns the long and difficult road to building socialism through political parties and the seizure of state power. Instead, it proffers a quote-unquote left critique of actually existing socialism and advocates for an alternative path to overcoming capitalism, the magical third way. This form of politics can take various different forms, such as the support for an insurgent disruption of the given order by spontaneous action, the immediate establishment of a direct workers' democracy, or the messianic postulation of a transcendent idea of communism to come. Whatever the case may be, these third-way proposals serve the purpose of radical recuperation. They sound radical due to their critiques of capitalism. However, since their proposed solutions are based on magical thinking, their radicality has no basis in material reality and concrete class struggles. Therefore, they actually serve to recuperate potentially radical forces within a process of capitalist accommodation. In the words of Gus Hall, quote, petty bourgeois radicalism does a very special favor to capitalism because it covers its anti-communism and anti-Sovietism with left radical phrases, end quote. Since it does not materially and concretely contribute to workers' struggles, but instead shores up the capitalist system, petty bourgeois radicalism serves first and foremost to consolidate the socioeconomic position of the professional intelligentsia within capitalism. As a form of class struggle, it struggles to maintain the class position of the professional managerial class strata. Final concluding section is on the contradiction of intellectual life under capitalism. So to develop theory, which is a necessity, as I mentioned earlier, according to Lenin, to make a socialist revolution, you need education, support, resources, time, and so on. Within capitalism, this tends to be possible primarily within the imperial intellectual apparatus, although there are, of course, some exceptions. In order to advance within that apparatus, meaning this whole system for the production of ideas, their distribution, and their consumption, you have to play by the rules of the game, at least to a certain extent. An entire system of norms and values must be respected if you want to ascend within the extant social order. These pressures and other forces tend to breed conformism. After all, the surest way to succeed in the imperial intellectual apparatus is to invest in an imperialist theoretical practice like Jürgen Habermas and Sheila Benhabib, whose fame in the system is itself indicative of their political orientation. I would like to conclude then by indicating two tactics and one overall strategy for dealing with the following contradiction. Intellectuals are capable of providing forms of objective analysis that are necessary to revolutionary transformation of society, but within the imperial intellectual apparatus, they're trained instead to contribute to imperialism, and their career advancement largely depends on the extent of their contribution, as mediated as this contribution might be. The first tactic might be referred to as Trojan horse intellectual labor. It consists in producing the appearance of work that is palatable to the extant system in some capacity, but that actually smuggles in an alternative message or does underground anonymous work. The advantage of this tactic is that it is feasible within the given system of knowledge production, and it leverages power for those who can benefit from the time, resources, and training of the capitalist system of knowledge production. The disadvantage is that it often requires extensive sacrifices and compromises and can easily remain somewhat precarious. The second tactic, and I'm going to finish here in 2-3 minutes, Carlos. The second tactic consists in cultivating worker intellectuals who have greater freedom to do counter-hegemonic theoretical research because their livelihood is not dependent upon the imperial intellectual apparatus or because they work anonymously. One of the clearest examples in the current context is the work of Norman Finkelstein and everything that he's been doing around the most recent genocidal assault against the Palestinians. He's saying things and taking positions that are directly opposed to those of Habermas and Benhabib. If he had an academic job, he could easily lose it. However, since he was already the object of a heinous campaign that left him bereft of an academic position, this simply is not possible. There are many other examples that could be pointed to, including, of course, the work of intellectuals who never had stable university positions, like Michael Parenti, as well as those who never taught in the academy at all, such as George Jackson. It is important in this regard that counter-hegemonic intellectual work often goes hand in hand with the development of an alternative apparatus of knowledge production, circulation, and reception. Such an apparatus seeks to put power in the hands of the people rather than the ownership class, thereby democratizing intellectual labor and learning. I take it that all of the three organizations that have co-sponsored this event are, in different ways, with various objectives and with very limited resources, attempting to do something along these lines. The more resources that can be leveraged in this direction, the more opportunities there will be to support the work of intellectual workers who are not ensconced in the bourgeois academy. Final words, both of these tactics can put intellectuals in the service of the socialist cause. However, the overall strategy needs to be the building of a socialist intellectual apparatus in which the educational system functions of, by, and for the people. This is not an easy task, and the establishment of a socialist country does not magically bring this about. Struggles continue after revolutions, of course, to further develop, perfect, and democratize systems of intellectual production, circulation, and reception. This can be a very long and difficult process, but it must remain the horizon of our work.